G'day ladies and gents, welcome back to the channel. My name is Dan, and last week I put out a video about the 5 reasons to consider buying Boeing stock. And it was a massive hit, by far my most popular video so far, and it was just amazing to see your feedback. I got some amazing comments, lots of likes, and so many new subscribers. So if that was one of you, thank you very much. And if it wasn't, and you haven't subscribed yet, then what are you even doing? Now, the reason I've made this video today is because I noticed that there were a few comments last week where people were saying, I don't like Boeing. I don't think they're a good stock. I don't trust the company. And those are actually really valid arguments. And it's really important for us as investors to consider both sides of the equation. Otherwise, we're at risk of falling into what's called a confirmation bias trap, I guess you would call it. And what confirmation bias is, if you don't know, it's kind of like if a girl goes to her boyfriend or her husband and says, hey, which dress do you prefer, the red one or the black one? And we all know it doesn't matter which one we choose. It makes absolutely no difference. Ladies, gents, back me up on that one. What's really happening is they want us to agree with the choice that they have already made in their head. That's all that's happening. And that's confirmation bias. So that's why today I want to break this video down into 3 parts. The first, I'm going to talk about the negatives of BA stock. Then I'm going to talk about the positives. And if you wait around to the end, I'm going to give you my opinion on whether I think they are a good buy or whether they are an avoid. Just before we get into it, I want to make one thing super clear. Today's video and last week's video are talking about the long-term prospects of Boeing. I could not even pretend to know what's going to happen in the short term. And anyone who tells you that they do know is either lying, totally just oblivious and ignorant, or they're insider trading. All of those 3 things are not advice that you should be taking. And the fact of the matter is, that is impossible. By the way, these are my fiance's glasses. Look how crooked they are. I wish I had this level of chill. And by the way, these are not the only glasses that are like that. Here's another wonky pair that she has, which, by the way, ooh, pulling them off. All right, enough goofing around. Let's get to the serious stuff. Moving on. In fact, cue the intro. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is, in my opinion, what I think is the most significant and holds the most negative weight towards Boeing, and it could be their biggest hurdle going forwards. In 2016, they debuted a new plane, the 737 MAX, and quite frankly, there were issues that they knew about that they hid from regulators, and they got the plane over the line, and the results were a disaster. They had 2 very, very significant crashes that resulted in 346 deaths, which I know that I don't need to say, but that is the ultimate tragedy. And the fact that it could have been avoided is just abysmal, and it really is horrendous. Aside from the obvious problems that causes Boeing and how much that damaged their reputation, since then, Boeing took action and took all 400 of their aircraft out of action and actually stopped producing them temporarily, which has only just started picking up at the end of May. But the reality is, it was too little too late, and the damage had already been done, especially with their biggest competitor Airbus lurking, just waiting for their opportunity to pounce and take over and become the kingpin of that industry, which they're not very far away from doing. Since those 2 Boeing crashes, Airbus has been kicking butt and have really taken advantage of the market, while Boeing has been severely wounded. For the full year of 2019, Boeing delivered 380 aircraft, while Airbus set a new all-time annual record, handing over 863 jets. Prior to this, Boeing had retained a deliveries lead over Airbus since 2012, which just shows you how significant these 2 crashes were in damaging the reputation of Boeing. And that's all a good company needs. They just need a sniff to really start to penetrate the market. That was a really weird choice of words, but I'm going with it. Which brings us to our second reason to be concerned. Boeing announced huge layoffs in staff in order to save money because they were struggling to operate with their new increasing debts and their severely lowered revenue. And with lowered production rates, as well as not knowing when flights are going to go back to normal, they made the decision to cut staff because it's a pretty easy way to cut costs. And it's horrible to say that, and the optics are terrible, especially at the moment when unemployment rates are at record levels. It's not a good looking way to do it, but it was a necessary decision for Boeing to make. And by the way, that is only the first wave of layoffs. They've announced that they're probably looking to do more layoffs in the future. On to concern number 3. It turns out that not everybody watching this video has hit the thumbs up button. So do me a favor, turn that sucker blue, and while you're down there, just scooch over a little bit, hit that red subscribe button. It's time to join the fam, and we'd love to have you. All right, the real third concern for Boeing is that since old mate Uncle Roni came to town and hit the world hard, they have acquired an exorbitant amount of debt. Now, this is not unique at the moment, and they are certainly not alone, but the airline industry got absolutely decimated by this pandemic, and Boeing were no exception to the rule, clocking up some serious debt. And in an effort to avoid a bailout from the Fed, effectively giving up part of their ownership to the government, Boeing recently made a decision to sell $25 billion worth of debt to its investors. But to do that, they had to offer very high interest rates, some reaching 5.15%. This brought their debt total up to $54 billion, which Robert Stallard, an analyst with Vertical Research Partners, said is 22 times their projected earnings for the year, not including interest, taxes, or depreciation. He then went on to say that Boeing is arguably owned by the banks. And that paints a very dark portrait for Boeing, because the fact of the matter is they're going to have to pay that debt back somehow. And by the way, the best way to think about debt for a company is borrowing from their future earnings. And that brings us to concern number 4, which is that right after Hurricane Corona hit the planet, they started to see a massive drop off in their orders, as well as huge increases in cancellations. Now, while they had a lot of cancellations, they also had a lot of orders that were deferred. And in case you don't know what that means, I'm going to talk about it later in this video. But in 2019, they had their worst year in decades for aircraft orders, which has been compounded by the Roni, with their orders down 67% this year compared to the same time last year, which just goes to show you that sometimes when bad times hit, they get even more badderer, or worse. And that brings me to point numero 5, which is Boeing's management. It's been very well documented that in recent years, Boeing's management has been very dishonest and very competitive with their aircraft production. And considering they're in the airspace and overall travel industry, that is just totally not acceptable and definitely not something that you want on your resume. And the worst of it was they found out that these issues were actually avoidable, and their efforts to conceal the technical design failures were dishonest and put people's lives in jeopardy. And if you ask me, pressure that they receive from their competitors in Airbus is absolutely, unequivocally not a good enough excuse, and it leaves a very sour taste in people's mouth. And we all know one thing to be consistent: it's very hard to earn people's trust, and it is very easy to lose it. Which brings us to the back half of this video, where I want to look at the positives, and I'll be a little bit more brief with the positives because I did do a video last week. So if you want more details on that, I'll leave the link over here and I'll leave it in the description box down below as well. And don't forget, at the end of the video, I'm going to give you my opinion on whether I think they're a buy or an avoid. So if you want to see that, stick around to the end. First up, let's have a look at their management issues, because as I mentioned earlier, Boeing in recent years has been famous for deceit and cover up and a lack of transparency with their regulators and investors, and it resulted in Dennis Muhlenberg, their CEO, stepping down really abruptly, almost immediately. And since then, his throne has been filled by the board's chairman, who just so happens to have one of the coolest names in town, David Calhoun. Sorry, I don't know why, but saying it like that really tickles my funny bone. Now, the good news about David Calhoun, I'll say his name normally now, is that it seems to be really well received, and he seems to have a great reputation, along with a lot of experience. He's been in aviation for 20 years. He's been on Boeing's board for 10 years, so he's not someone that's just come out of the darkness. And one thing he made very, very clear from the get-go when he took over that position is that he really wants to mend these wounds and right these wrongs. And he actually said that he strongly believes in Boeing and the 737 MAX. And considering he was on the board during the entire production of the 737 MAX, theoretically that means that he should be able to pick out some of the issues with it, and he should be able to right those wrongs. The next positive I want to look at is the cancellations of their orders. And that seems funny, but as I alluded to earlier, a lot of their orders weren't cancelled and instead were deferred, which basically means that customers have still agreed to hold their orders, but they're going to take possession of those aircraft at a future date. So the reason this is a positive is, first of all, a lot of their orders are still on hold, so they will place those orders. And what happens to investors is it becomes very deceptive when looking at their balance sheet. So let's go over and have a squiz at their balance sheet so you can see what I'm talking about. As you can see here, they have over $50 million worth of deferred revenue, which is more than half of their entire current liability total. So while this is still recorded as a liability, when the orders are eventually carried out, these liabilities become assets. And if you're not experienced at looking at balance sheets, or if it's just something you didn't know about, it can make it really difficult to properly assess their financials. But the fact that they have so many deferred orders, I see that as a swing towards the positive. Now, the third positive I want to look at is that Boeing's biggest customer is actually the US government. So it's not in their best interest for Boeing to fail. And I know it doesn't quite work like this, but it kind of acts like their insurance policy. Again, not quite how it works, but also kind of. And with both being so important to each other, it's kind of hard to see the government allowing them to fail. You know what I mean? All right, the fourth positive is that Boeing actually have a very diversified company, far more diversified than the other airlines in the industry. They actually have 3 different main revenue earning streams. They have commercial airplanes, defense, space and security, and global services, which allows them to earn money in 3 different ways across a very diversified sector within the aircraft and broad travel platform. All right, my fifth positive is that they just started to ramp up their production of the 737 MAX, which is a huge step in the right direction for them, especially if they've sorted out those issues. And that actually just started at the end of May. Now, the sixth positive, and it's one of the biggest and most important, is that they have an enormous competitive advantage in their industry. They only have a couple of major competitors, and it's because it is such a hard nut to crack. It is incredibly capital intensive, incredibly difficult to do. They need a lot of space, and it means that there are very high barriers to entry for that industry. At the moment, Airbus and Boeing are clearly the 2 big dogs at the table, and considering they're in the government's back pocket, that definitely gives them enormous competitive advantage. I like to know that a company has either a unique service or a superior service, or offers the same service but at a cheaper rate. That's going to give them the leg up that they need to prosper in the future. That is what is most important for a long-term investor. And as promised, I want to offer you my opinion on Boeing, and I can acknowledge that there have been some really bad decisions made by Boeing in recent times, and there are definitely really strong arguments for why they're going to struggle for many years, but I do think that they're making all the right moves. I think they're taking action, and I think that their management decisions will lead them in the right direction. And that's why I believe that long-term, they are a good buy. All right, gang, it's been a real pleasure. I can't wait to do this with you again. If you haven't already, hit that thumbs up button until it turns blue. Hit the subscribe button to join the family. And until next time, I'm Dan, and you've been Dansplained. See ya!